Hey guys, welcome back to another whiteboard chat, and today we're going to talk about cortisol patterns. So this was actually a request video. Someone had requested essentially what we're looking at when we're looking at cortisol tests. So specifically full day, like 4-point type cortisol tests. What do the patterns actually signify? What might cause them? So on and so forth. So I have 5 different patterns here. I think it's 5, yeah. So we have normal, hypo, hyper, inconsistent, and a flip-flop pattern. Now, I'm going to go through each one, or go through them, talk about what might cause them, what's more common, so on and so forth, and hopefully this will help you if you're looking at these type of tests. All right, first off, normal, obviously. In a normal pattern, we're generally going to see some rise before waking up. It's gonna keep rising as we wake up. This is an awakening response. So that's actually one of the tests that you might see as a cortisol awakening response test. And then it should rise and eventually come down later in the day. Obviously, we don't want it to be high when we're sleeping. So this isn't a perfectly timed chart. I do not have hours or anything timed on here, but you will see AM, PM, waking and sleep. And then it's obviously dropping off. And then throughout the night, which would be the gaps that we don't see, it's going to be lower. Now, this little peak in here could be in various places throughout the day. Everyone's circadian patterns are going to be a little bit different. The hours aren't going to be exactly the same person to person because people might have different sleep and wake times, right? But generally, they're going to correspond to your normal sleep-wake time. So that's another reason that I'm always hugely advocating having consistent sleep and wake times as much as possible. And this is also another reason that things like shift work are very difficult on your body because it's very hard for your body to establish these type of normal patterns, okay? So that's obviously what we want. that's normal. So hypo, and I'm not going in any particular order of importance, but hypo or insufficient all day. This would be adrenal insufficiency. That's going to be illustrated by this flat pattern on the bottom. Now, this flat pattern it still might have some up and down as the day goes on, but generally we're going to be looking at a hypo or adrenal insufficient pattern for most of the day or even all of the day. So this signifies little to no cortisol at all. Production is low. This is a burnout state. This is where cortisol signaling has been chronic. So think, hypothalamus, pituitary, CRH. Think about these hormones, right? That's when this pathway has been abused chronically. Adrenal glands are not producing cortisol. Not only are they not producing cortisol to facilitate this normal daily pattern, but they're also not producing cortisol for events, so training, we're talking about things like stress during the day, anything that your body might need cortisol for, it's not going to be there because your adrenal glands are basically burnt out in this state. This is a chronic situation. So this isn't something that's going to happen quickly. This will take time. This isn't a response to a direct stressor. You're not going to have a stressful day and then be in an adrenal insufficient state. This takes a lot of time. For some people, it's more than others. This is something I might see after contest prep, for example, or people that are chronically stressed for really long periods of time. I actually just did a consult with someone the other day, and they had basically been in this state of adrenal abuse for, we had to have been years, several years. And they finally reached this adrenal insufficient state, and that would be a case of a very resilient, adrenal function. It took them quite a while. For other people, it might be a little bit quicker. But yeah, this isn't something that's going to happen overnight. This is pretty much like in-phase adrenal fatigue type of issue. So there could also be potentially people with certain autoimmune issues that could run into this. Okay, hyper, which would be obviously high most of the day. Now, there can be variations of this, which I'll talk about in the inconsistency, but yeah, hyper is going to be right here. In this case, I still drew some awakening response, right? And then I drew a high most of the day. And I didn't necessarily mean to draw this peak at night, though there is a situation where this peak at night is going to happen, and I'll talk about that. Okay. And that's going to be in the flip-flop phase, which we'll talk about. But hyper, yeah, hyper is something that could happen in acute or chronic situations. It could be someone that's just stressed very often. It could be someone that is been stressed for a long time. So it's acute or chronic. This is before they've gotten to this state. Eventually, they will generally end up here if not corrected. Okay, and depending on severity, but this is going to be high cortisol. You're going to see, if you were looking at a 4-point test, you're going to see it out of range most of the time, most of the day. Okay. Now, inconsistent, be sporadic patterns. So I just drew this little squiggly line all over the board. Yeah, it's going to be just that. It's inconsistent. So this could be somebody that is has large stressors throughout the day. So I've actually seen patterns like this where I would have them go through their daily routine, whether it was work or whatever it might be, and I would see these really big spikes. So this is somebody that I would have take like a Dutch test, Dutch adrenal, for example, where I can actually get multiple points of analysis. And we'll see normal awakening response in the morning, perhaps, and then they get to work, boom, cortisol shoots up. So like that 2nd AM reading that we get on a lot of those tests, which is normally sometimes like a 10 AM-ish reading, it's way up. Or they're okay throughout the day, and then boom, big spike at night because they have a really rough home environment, right? So those things could signify different issues throughout their day. Or, you know, obviously if they're training in there, you could see a spike, right? But those things would, again, indicate some type of stressor throughout the day. Now, is that a bad thing? Maybe, maybe not. Obviously, in a chronic sense, yes, it's going to be bad because we're probably going to end up either with this hyper at some point or end up hypo if they're constantly having these big spikes. Because again, we have this finite amount of resources. Eventually, we're going to run out. Okay. Eventually, that signaling pathway is going to be abused to the point of not being able to signal when it needs to. And then, of course, there's all kinds of other things that come along with these high cortisol situations. In males, potentially the feedback loop with testosterone. In females, you know, we're talking about feedback loop with progesterone. In both cases, thyroid health, also, you know, gut motility, you know, all the issues that can arise in your GI. So that would be inconsistent. Again, that could be acute or chronic. Flip-flop patterns. Now, this is actually pretty common. You'd be surprised. This is one that I would normally see in the people that are, it's the kind of the same, I would say, as common as the hyper. We'll say that. It's common as hyper. This is just like it sounds. We have low in the morning and high at night. Really not ideal. So this is where things start to get really difficult because I notice a lot of these people end up in this hypo eventually. Why? Well, they're tired during the day, so what do? Abuse stimulants, right? They're high at night, so what happens? They can't sleep, right? So they're not rested, and then they wake up tired again. So not only are they tired during the day, but they can't even get sufficient sleep to fix this issue. So it makes it very difficult to fix this, right? Yeah, so this is a less than ideal pattern that normally leads to something worse. With these, yeah, that was our last one. So with these, I'll talk about a little bit of correction, potentially. So we'll just start here and work backwards. So with flip-flop patterns, I would, if we're talking about, I'm talking about outside of lifestyle stuff, because stress reduction is always going to be first and foremost in any of these adrenal dysfunction issues. I mean, it's going to be at least 75% of the fix, simply because we can throw supplements and all these things at it, and it's not going to do much good if stress is chronic. So with this flip-flop pattern, I like to use something that might be more adrenal stimulating in the morning, potentially, and a little more of a adrenal reducing at night. So great combination I like is a morphogen adaptogen in the morning, and then we go with morphocalm at night to help try to flip-flop this pattern. Also with that, we're trying to correct sleep and wake times as much as possible. I see flip-flop patterns in people that work shifts, people that don't have consistent sleep and wake times. So those are some people that are going to be maybe potentially a little more susceptible to this. So yeah, those would be, I would look at adrenal stimulation in the morning, things that might help with the awakening response, getting light exposure in the morning. Some things, I have someone in this state right now, we use a sunlight alarm clock, starts to rise in the morning, or starts to brighten in the morning. It gets that exposure and then helps them get a more normal awakening response, and then we're working on their light exposure reduction at night. And we're slowly flipping that pattern along with, you know, the supplementation and then just the general stress reduction, okay? In those people as well, look for melatonin levels. If you're using like a Dutch test, it generally tests melatonin. Make sure that their melatonin levels are correct, because if not, that can signify some definite circadian issues. Sleep normally is the problem. Inconsistent, well, you know, like I said, if it's inconsistent because of just chronic stressors, like an environmental issue, then that's going to be your biggest thing. Now, you can't take someone out of their work environment necessarily, so it may be talking to them about stress perception. That's always, you know, frankly, that's probably the biggest thing that I kind of hammer home with clients, is that stress perception piece, because we can't remove stress very often. We can some, but we can't completely change our environments. So that stress perception piece is good. I mean, I even have people that seek therapy to help with stress management tools, get some outside perspective. You know, just learning to use logic over emotion when making decisions and approaching these situations. And you can correct this issue 99% of the time with those type of techniques, okay? And then you could also do something like the morphocalm or cortisol suppression type of supplementation during the times that are higher, right? And the better you get at responding, the better off these patterns will get. Hyper, kind of the same thing. I'm going to go pretty much cortisol suppression most of the time. I'm also going to talk about, obviously, stress techniques. Now, here's one of the things is awareness is always a big issue. So a lot of the time with these hyper people, or these hyperadrenal or hypercortisol type people, awareness is poor. It's really bad. They're just totally unaware of how stressed they are. I'll use the different mechanisms or different types of systems to have them track their actual amount of times they get stressed and track their overall stress load, and then we have some data and then we can correct it. But without that awareness, it's really difficult to improve your stress perception if you don't know how stressed you are or aren't aware of when you're actually getting stressed. And I think that's commonly the biggest issue, is that they just are completely clueless as to how stressed they actually are. It can even manifest into things like grinding your teeth at night or during the day, or biting the insides of your mouth, or people chewing on their fingernails, or getting TMJ in your jaw from clenching or whatever. There's a lot of little things I start picking up on, and it's like, yeah, you're way more stressed than you think, and most people are just completely unaware because it's a very subjective thing, right? It may be something that they're just totally used to, and that's just how they are, but they really react completely poorly to everything. Everything frustrates them, everything aggravates them. So that would be the type of person that it's almost entirely lifestyle related, and we can use some of that cortisol suppression type of supplementation as well on a basic level. So keep in mind, so there are other supplementation things like helping with the cortisol receptor, perhaps, potential nutrient deficiencies and things that go in there. But I'm talking about just in a general sense without knowing a whole lot about the person. And these are mostly my experience with these things, as they're pretty common issues. So I'm giving you like the most common scenarios. Okay. All right. Hypo. Yeah, we're going to want to bring cortisol up. So we can do some of the same awakening techniques that I talked about in the flip-flop patterns. We can use the same type of supplements that I talked about in the for awakening response. We can use the light exposure. So those things are really important, right? This normally takes the longest time to fix, right? It's going to take a lot of stress reduction, total load, reducing total workload output. We're talking about no training to failure. We're talking about reps in reserve for long periods of times. We're talking about low amounts of cardio, especially any type of intense cardio. So any type of, maybe it's a little bit of low impact, perhaps. We're talking about fixing sleep and wake patterns, circadian patterns, stress reduction, awareness, perception, like all of these things are going to play into this. This is a person that has been in this state for a very long time. So we need to pull out all the stops and correct everything the best we can. Okay. They did not get to this state by mistake. This wasn't something that happened quickly. They have a lot of problems that accumulated. Normal. Don't do anything. Keep doing what you're doing. If you're normal, you're probably doing a lot of these things anyhow. So again, like I said, awareness is always a big thing. Just, you got to really be aware of how you're actually feeling and not be as subjective. And even if you're working with a coach, like I know people work with a coach and you can use that as a way to give feedback. For me personally as a coach, it doesn't really do me any good if you're not being completely, if you're being really, really subjective in your feedback. It's like, well, you don't say you're stressed, but I can tell that you're stressed by what I'm seeing in the updates and the numbers and the lab work and your body's response and so on and so forth. So the more you can learn to do that yourself, the less we have to pry and figure things out. So I hope that helps. Like I said, these are just that's just what I see typically when I'm looking at these patterns. Those are the most common types of things that I'm going to do in terms of fixing them. So hopefully that helps you guys when you run into these situations or you're looking at some of this testing, and we'll talk to you next time.